Thank you, Eric. So, my name is Sébastien Duquette. I'm a malware researcher at ESET since 2011, and we're a small team in Montreal. We're doing security research, and we're trying to find new trends in malware distribution, and that is part of this research. So I want to start off by saying thanks to a couple of people. So first, my colleagues at ESET Canada. What I'm going to present is part of a team effort, and especially Marc-Etienne Léveillé, who did most of the work on CDorked, which I'm going to talk about in the second part of the presentation. I also want to say thanks to Suckery, which is a company that offers services for cleanups. In cases you have infected servers, they will help their clients. And they sent us the samples of Linux malware. In some of the cases, those were the first samples we got, so that helped us start analysis on those cases. And I want to also thank Catherine, which is a security researcher. Probably a lot of you know him. And he provided a lot of useful information on those cases. So thank you. So what is this presentation about? So exploit kits, I assume pretty much all of you know what exploit kits are. They are softwares that will try to use vulnerabilities in your browser to infect your computer with malware. So those things have become a major vector of infections during the couple of last years. And there's many ways to, you need to bring traffic to those exploit kits for them to be useful. So we're seeing cyber criminals use many ways to bring the traffic to the kits. Spam, for example, or malicious advertisement. A third approach is to redirect visitors from compromised websites. And so when the visitors go on their usual website they go to every day, some of them will be redirected to the exploit kits. And the methods we used to see a lot were, it's almost always JavaScript or injected iframes. And we used to see a lot of, and we're still seeing, flaws in popular web platforms like WordPress or Joomla being abused to inject those scripts. Or they would use stolen or brute force passwords to get FTP access to the server and modify it. But in the last year and a half now, we found multiple cases where malware was used on Linux servers for this purpose. So the first documented case is a module called Leech. It's an Apache module that was first documented in September 2012. Then there was another one called Snaxo, which has a Linux rootkit component and also does iframe injection. And finally, CDorked in April 2013, which does the same thing. So in this presentation, I'm going to cover two groups, Home and CDorked, which are using those modules. And we're going to focus on the redirection chain, so the part between when a user gets redirected from a legitimate website and where he ends up on the exploit kit. And the overall idea of the presentation is to provide a snapshot of how things are being done by groups that try to distribute malware with exploit kits in 2012, 2013. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Home group. So that's a typical view of what a user would get when visiting a compromised website. In this case, we can see that at the bottom there's a when the browser requested the jQuery JavaScript file. Completely at the top, there's a little snippet of JavaScript that adds an iframe to another URL. And what is highlighted in yellow is pretty typical of this group. The q.php pattern at the end used to be always there in the URL, so you could spot it quite rapidly. That was, some of you might have seen this in February. One of the websites of the Los Angeles Times was infected with this thing, and As you can see, this is an article from Avast, and as you can see in the screenshot, there's this same Q.php pattern. So I was talking about the pattern in the URLs. So back in 2011, the earliest traces of this this malware campaign being active is from February 2011, and back in that time, there used to be a pattern. The OM keyword was found in all the URLs, so that's where we named the group based on. And in 2012, with Black Hole, they're using the Black Hole exploit kit. So when they switched to Black Hole version 2, they also moved to this very strange-looking pattern that has a something that looks like hexadecimal characters or some kind of a hash, and then Q.php. And finally, in August 2013, they moved to the typical Black Hole pattern you would see with some random keywords, so that you wouldn't have this pattern that is really easy to spot. So that's what the redirection chain looks for this this group. So when a user visits a website, like I already showed, there's for one of the document an iframe is added, then it will request a document from another another server, which was on a different server, and this request would bring back the landing page of the Black Hole exploit kit and try to infect the browser. And what we found, Leech was actually installed on both those layers of servers, so the infected servers and the kind of proxy layer to get the exploit kit. So concerning the infected servers, we found a couple. So during the year that was changing a lot, but it stayed around a couple hundred websites at a time that were infected. We found cases of government website, for example, in Canada, that were infected. So this was pretty distributed across across the globe. And so I mentioned Dark Leech. So basically, what this is an Apache module, and it's only used to insert content, JavaScript content, in some of the pages. That's a kind of a kit. So it's being sold on forums. It sells for about $1,000 US. And for those in the back that might not see, this is the advertisement from the forums, and it's in Russian. The way it works, it's actually quite simple. Apache supports hooks, so you can manipulate the request. And every time a request for a document arrives, it checks some conditions, and based on those conditions, it will decide if it injects or not the script in the page. So the content to inject is fetched from a server. The address is hard-coded in the binary. And as you can see, the URL for it's via the HTTP protocol. And the URL for to get the injects actually still contain the OM pattern even after they switch their the pattern in the URLs you would get redirected to. And so the script to inject would come back. It's encrypted with a little XOR, and then the module will inject it. So once we got the module, we made a script to fetch the URLs, the scripts that would be injected, and we figured out the URLs would change the module makes requests every 10 minutes, and every single time almost we made a request, a different URL on either a different IP address or a different domain was coming back. So we're seeing a lot, many different IP addresses and URLs. The module that has already been documented a lot on the internet. I just want to say a quick words. There's multiple evasion for detection methods that are implemented. For example, they will blacklist IP addresses. Once you got the redirection, it won't redirect you again. There's another one that I find quite interesting is the UTMP check. So on Linux servers, UTMP is a file that contains information about the users that are currently logged on the server. And if you're visiting the website from one of those IP addresses, you won't get the script. So the idea here is that if you're a system administrator and you're trying to get someone reports to you, oh, your server is infected, well, when you're going to try to replicate it, you connect by SSH, for example, on your server, and you try to browse at the same time, you might not get the redirection. So that was for the first layer of infected servers. And the second layer, what we found out is that all of those servers, when we looked at them, they were either controlled by cPanel or Plesk, which is another kind of control panel to manage multiple websites. We're going to see why those servers were being used. To give you an idea, this is, when I was saying we were seeing a lot of IP addresses, this is a list of new IP addresses we have seen for the first time on a single day during this year. And very, very often we would see tens or even hundreds of new IP addresses that we didn't see before. So I was really wondering, how did they manage to get access to that many IP addresses? And one of the things that might not be apparent because it's a bit small, but there's a lot of those IP addresses that are in the same network ranges. So what we did is we went in our data collection and extracted all the URLs that match this pattern. And what we found out is that up to this point, that was back in March of this year, there were already 40,000 IP addresses that had been used by this group. And they were very heavily localized in certain specific network ranges. For example, this one was the worst, 129, 121. There were 5,000 IP addresses that we had already seen being used for the redirections. So again, we were really wondering, how did they manage to control all those IP addresses? In May 2013, we were finally lucky, and after contacting a lot of infected websites, we got the module that was making the redirections on this second layer of servers. And what we found is that it was also a dark Leech module, but it had some additional code that we didn't find in the original module you would buy. And what it did is it was basically it would take the domain name in the URL, and it would calculate a MD5 sum, MD5 hash. It would add the keyword "salt" and check if the resulting hash was found in the URL. So this way they would decide, okay, for those URL we want to proxy them, and for the other ones we keep acting normally on the server. And they were using ModProxy, which is a proxy module for Apache, to forward the request to another server behind and get the black hole exploit kit. And so this is the request. We managed to get a small packet capture from one of the infected server. And as you can see, they would add, what is highlighted in red is they would add a field with the MD5 of the server so they can verify that you come from if you try to forge the request, that won't work. On the first dark Leech control server, because both servers were different, but on the first layer, I said it was using HTTP. So there was actually an HTTP server there, and the directory listing was enabled on the server. And in one of the folders, there was a group of lists that contain like lots of URLs. So what it was is, for every server that they had compromised, it contained the list that they had extracted of all the IP addresses and the valid URLs that you could use on those servers. With cPanels and those kinds of software, it's really easy. You usually manage a lot of servers, so they would extract all the IP addresses that were controlled by those servers, and this way they could make a rotation and use all of them. So there was 67 servers that had been compromised, and together they control a total of 53,000 URLs. One of them, you can see it, it's like 900 kilobytes, was controlling 20,000 domains. It was some kind of SEO server that was controlling a lot of domains. So this one was controlling 20,000. And so yeah, at that time, when we found those lists, there were about 25,000 server that was, no, sorry, not 25,000 servers, but 25,000 URLs that were still available for the rotation. So as we would block them, they would use constantly new ones because they had access to so many. Another thing we found together with the file was a script, and luckily it had been renamed php_old, so we were, as it was not evaluated, we were able to get a copy. What the script was doing is they would go through the lists, select a few URLs at random, and try to make requests with a specific URL and also user agent. So it wouldn't, in that case, the backend server wouldn't make the usual checks. And what they were using the script for is to check for it was expecting a specific response, and that will allow them to check if a server was still infected. But with this information and with the list, we could use the same information to check that servers were still infected and make notification with it. So prior to getting this information, every time we tried to contact infected websites, the owners, it gave almost no results. The provider were not able to reproduce the issue, so they would think that their server was not infected. By the time we reported our URLs, they were not used anymore. So when they were checking in their logs, they wouldn't see them. And that's created a lot of back and forth between the clients, the providers, the web hosts, and us. So what we did with those, when we obtained those lists, is we sent a list. So for every compromised server, we sent the list of affected IP addresses and host names. The host name of the controlling cPanel server for each of them. A method which was kind of a really small curl command that you could use to confirm that your server was still proxying the requests, and a little script to find the dark Leech module on the server. And out of 30 servers that we notified, 21 of them were clean after we contacted them. So, and that resulted in a really considerable decrease in the number of URLs that were in the rotation. And for the other ones, we had access to those lists, so we could block them and notify the source and other parties so that they will know those were compromised. Finally, I want to say a quick few words on the malware they were distributing. So I mentioned Caffeine. He posted those stats from the black hole panel on his website. One of the things you can see is that there's only hits for Internet Explorer. That was one of the things. They would only get traffic from Internet Explorer. If you use another browser, they would not redirect you. And back in April, there were already 2.5 million computers that were successfully infected by this black hole panel. And Capian told me that at that time there were about 30,000 new infections every 24-hour periods. So even though the number of websites that were compromised was slightly low in terms of botnets, it still resulted in a very large number of people or computers being infected. And concerning the malware that is distributed, one of them is Ponyloader, which has downloader functionality, but it has also functionality to steal credentials from many types of client software, but especially FTP software. So we think that that's probably the way they get access to the server where they install the Apache modules, the dark Leech modules. And they're also using affiliate programs, third-party malware to monetize their traffic. So there were two strains of ransomware, Urazi and Nymane, that were distributed. And also Zero Access, which is a very known botnet or botnet. So the second group I want to talk about is CDorked. So there's a lot of similarity between this group and the other one in the way they are working. So they are also using compromise Linux servers. In this case, it's modify HTTP daemon. They would replace the daemon instead of using a module. They were using black hole, and they were also using third-party or affiliate programs to monetize their traffic. And this group in particular was using a lot of efforts to limit the discovery either by the administrators of the servers, but also to make tracking and analysis more difficult. They were really favoring long-term persistence in those networks, in those servers, and they were trading part of the potential traffic they could get so that they wouldn't be detected. So this is what a typical redirection would look like. When one of the documents is redirected, what they would do is they send a 302 redirect, and they send the request to another server. And I'm going to talk later about the requests in between, but at the end you would get the black hole exploit kit. So again, the number of servers were in the couple hundreds. That was staying pretty stable during the year. So as servers were being cleaned, they would add new ones. Together, those servers were hosting thousands of websites because, again, a lot of those servers were hosting tens or even hundreds of websites. And in those websites, there were 50 that were in the Alexa top 100,000, which are getting a lot of traffic. And one of them was at some point during the year in the top 1,000. So this one was getting probably a lot of traffic. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of redirections per day. So the malware they were using, we called it CDorked. It's a modified HTTPD daemon. We found variants for Apache, Light HTTPD, and Nginx. The configuration of for everything in the behavior of the redirections is stored in RAM. So they're using the POSIX IPC shared memory. And there's no configuration stored either in the binary module itself or on disk. But the fact that they were using the POSIX IPC made it possible that even if you restarted the HTTPD server, the configuration would still be there, still be active. And to configure the modules, they would send HTTP post requests to the server and configure it this way. So this is a screenshot for the Apache server, and you can see that they were adding checks for the get and the post requests. So this is for the every time a GET request would come in, those are the checks that they would do. Every single yellow box is a condition that they would check. So they would check. They were checking a lot of things to decide either they would redirect your request or not. They were, for example, checking for usual headers that you would expect from a browser, except language. If your request does not have it, they would not give you the redirection. The same thing for pages that might be for administrative panels or, for example, billing. They would not redirect, and they would redirect you only once per 24-hour period. And there's also a quite complex rate limiting algorithm in it, so that they would. I'll show graphs in a couple of slides, but they would usually use the server in a big spike at a time, and then stop using it, so that it would not be constantly used throughout time. And yeah, so the little red box is the point where you would be the page would be redirected, and for the small pink box that is bypassing all of this, there's also a remote shell that is accessible from the backdoor, so they could also access the server. So for the configuration, they were using, like I was saying, post request. What they did is, if the cookie contained the keyword sec ID, that would be a configuration request. And another thing is that the commands were encrypted with the client IP. So depending on the IP address of the client that was connecting to configure, the commands would look different, even though it might be the same command. That's what a typical configuration request looked like. So you can see the SecID cookie. There's also a part of the command that is at the end of the path of the post request. And when the server was infected, it would reply with a 302 found to Google, and in the etag field, they would return statistics about the backdoor, about the number of clients that were redirected and that kind of stuff. And something that they did is that instead of using a static pattern for the configuration requests, they would check for specific letters at specific indexes in the URL. So for example, here, for one of the backdoors, they were checking for the letters L, U, and D. So when you look at the URLs, when they're all grouped this way, it's easier to see. But when someone would go through the logs of the server, it's less evident that they're all for the backdoor. So yeah, this is the list of commands that were available in the backdoor. I put it there more for reference. I'm not going to talk too much about that. So what we did is, since we did not have access to the configuration by analyzing the sample, we released a little script, a little tool to detect the presence of CDorked on the server and also extract the configuration from the memory. And we made a blog post and we asked system administrator to send us the configs if their servers happen to be infected. And we actually got back a couple. So we had a look at the configs, and there were some things that were interesting. One of them is the list of user agent that would be redirected. It were Internet Explorer 7 or 8, and as well as Firefox on Windows. But they would also redirect iPhone and iPad. So we were wondering if they were attempting to exploit and infect those devices as well. And we did a lot of tests to try to get this behavior, but in the end, they were only redirecting those devices to kind of adult websites, and they would get money from the referral. So it was less interesting than we expected. So yeah, another thing is that they put blacklists in there for IP ranges, and there were 23,000 ranges that were blocked. So those IP ranges wouldn't get the redirection. And when we summed it up and made the math, it was blocking 50% of the IPv4 space from being redirected. So this does not really make a lot of sense if you want to infect as many people as possible, but it would make it really difficult if you are trying to replicate the behavior. When we were testing sometimes, at first when we were trying to replicate the behavior on the infected website, we would not get the redirections. So that's part of the reason why 1 out of 2 would not get redirected, only based on this blacklist. So as the backdoor was keeping a list of IP addresses it had already redirected, in this way they wouldn't redirect it again for a 24-hour period. Since there was this information in the configs and there was also a timestamp, we could map the when were visitors redirected. And what we found is that they would redirect a lot of people during a short period of time, and then as the server were still infected, but they wouldn't redirect anymore. And then at some point later, sometimes 2 months later, they would start using it again. So coming back to the redirection chain, there were 2 intermediate requests which I didn't talk about. There are some interesting things that you can spot on those URLs. One of the things is that, well, you see a request to a new domain name. Those domains we would see a couple of them different. And there was a subdomain in those URLs that were quite weird. And as you can see in the subsequent requests, you have this the first short subdomain. You can find it in the next ones, and it would request URLs with even longer subdomains. So those were quite. We were wondering how they were doing this. Yeah, so that's the extended one. And also in the first URL, there's a blob of data which is base64 encoded, and it contains once you decode it, it contains information such as the source URL of the page that was redirected, and also a timestamp and a source ID that is different for every compromised server. So this way they would tag the traffic that is coming to their exploit kit. And some of this information you can actually find in the long form subdomain. For example, the timestamp is in the long subdomain. So we did some other tests, and yeah, so the domains that were used, the DNS servers, were legitimate. So it was for legitimate websites. And the subdomains kept changing all the time. And we would even see the short subdomains, we would see the same ones, but on different servers. And as I already said, part of the subdomain was storing information. So my colleague Marc-Etienne started doing some tests with the URLs, and he found out that if you modify characters in the short subdomain, you would get back a different IP address from the server. So that was kind of that was telling that the server was most probably compromised. And by playing with it, he actually was able to reverse the algorithm that was encoding the IP address. So the IP address that you would get back from the DNS request was actually encoded in the domain name. So this way, by just changing the domain name, you could send your request to a different server. And so we published a second blog post. And after we did that, they changed the pattern of the URLs. It was a bit more complex, and if we try to modify the subdomains, it wouldn't change the IP address anymore. And after we published, we actually were able to obtain a copy of the DNS daemon of one of those servers, and it was really what we were expecting. So it's a bind DNS server that they had modified, and the short subdomain, it contained the IP address where the IP address that they wanted to get back from the request, as well as a timestamp and a checksum. And we think that they added the checksum after we published, so we wouldn't be able to just change the IP address by playing with it. And the subdomains were valid for 6 hours before the timestamp and 18 hours after. So if you try to replay those requests, it wouldn't work after some time. That caused a lot of headaches when we tried to notify those servers, because when they were trying it, they said, no, this is not responding anymore. And yeah, and again, in this case, there's absolutely no configuration stored on the server other than the backdoor, the modified DNS daemon, but there's absolutely nothing. All the config is through is encoded in the DNS request. So yeah, we managed to get a packet capture from one of the servers that was acting as a proxy to the black hole panel. So it's configured as a Nginx proxy. There's 9 other backend servers, and there's probably a couple more. This is kind of what they were describing in the presentation this morning about proxy networks. And at that time, there was 2 front-end servers. So the IP addresses that would answer, there were 2 servers that were active. And on a 2 days period, we collected 30 gigabytes of data. There was 1.1 million IP addresses that had connected to the black hole exploit kit. And there's about 30,000 computers that we estimate were infected during that period, which gives about a 2.5% success rate. And yeah, so they were using only the Java and Adobe Reader exploits. Quite surprisingly, the executable were not encrypted. So in black hole, you can, there was a new feature that, for example, the Java exploits, when it would trigger, it would download the executable, but it was encrypted, and the Java applet would decrypt it. In this case, they didn't activate it, so you don't really know why, but this is making detection in, for example, if you have an IDS, that would make it easier to see. And yeah, concerning what they would install on the computers, again, it was third-party malware affiliate programs. So for English-speaking countries, it was BOX. So for United States, United Kingdom, and Canada. And for all the others, they installed Glupteba, which is a click fraud malware that would generate clicks on ads. And in October, there was this quite big news that the author of the black hole exploit kit was arrested in Russia. And interestingly, the last time we saw traffic from the Home campaign is on October 4th, which is 4 days after it was confirmed, but the arrest might have happened before. So we don't know what happened, but I've heard some rumors that maybe those guys were arrested as well. And if someone can confirm that, I would be interested to know. And concerning CDorked, they're still active. They switched to the Neutrino exploit kit, and for them it's business as usual. So quick recap. What we're seeing here is the same pattern for everything else in malware. There's a specialization. These groups are really concentrating their effort on driving traffic to exploit kits. And we're also seeing a lot of proxies. This is the same thing we're seeing for CNCs of typical botnets. They're doing the same thing for those servers, and they're using a lot of methods to make the remediation hard and to stay under the radar as much as possible. And by contacting the affected parties, the websites that are infected, we can get a better understanding of how they're working. But it's really time consuming, and we have this chicken and egg problem that when we're contacting the web host, we're explaining, okay, we're seeing malicious traffic coming from your servers, but when they try to replicate this behavior or check in their logs, they're not seeing the problems. And quick slide on tracking methods. So we throughout those analysis, we used mostly telemetry data, so data we would see from our customers or users of our product, but it gives only partial visibility. You don't have the complete chain of redirection. So another method is to use automated and emulated browsers, but for the exploit kits, they're being a lot more sophisticated than they used to be a couple of years ago. So if you try, you should really only try to visit the compromised website if you want to get the exploits to trigger. If you try to directly go to the landing page of the exploit kit or one of the intermediate URL, most likely you will only get your IP address blacklisted. You also need support for JavaScript and plugins such as Java and PDF if you want to get the payload. And ideally use varied browser configurations and a large pool of distributed IP addresses that are geographically distributed. And concerning another method we use is the trackers. I mentioned it rapidly at the beginning. That worked quite well for the Dark Leech module. Since the CNC server was hard-coded in the module, it would need a lot of effort for them to go back and infect all the servers. So we didn't see this URL change a lot. So we were able to collect the URLs this way. But if we had just waited for those URLs to come, we would have waited a long time since they had access to that many IP addresses and domains. And yeah, maybe since I went quite fast, I had cut some content, but I can maybe talk about it. Yeah, so something that we found out is some of you might know about this SSH backdoor. It's called Ebery. So it's again an SSH a compromised SSH backdoor that we found on some servers. And what we found is that in multiple cases we found CDorked and Ebery together on some servers. And it also uses shared memory to store the configuration. And something that my colleague Markison is working on this thing right now, but something that we found is that the algorithm to decrypt the strings, the strings are encrypted in the binaries, and the algorithm to decrypt the strings is the same. And it's not a standard encryption algorithm. It seems to be something custom. And they're even using the same constant to initialize the algorithm. So we're really thinking that it's the same group of people that made the CDorked and the DNS, the backdoor DNS server that are behind this this SSH backdoor as well. So yeah, that was about it, about what I had to say. So is there any questions? Yes?
You mentioned bind at some point in time.
Yeah.
Modified bind, because we found many binds modified, but I was wondering if you reverse it completely and if you know exactly what is the modification they do inside bind.
Yeah, so in this case, I didn't put a screenshot of the assembly because the code is actually quite, if you look at bind, it's actually quite a complex piece of software. And the algorithm also they were using to, to extract the IP address is also quite complex. But the only modification that they added to those binaries was to extract, actually to extract the encoded IP address in the request. And they would check if the domain name was longer than, in the second version, it's 19 characters. If it was longer, it would start this this algorithm to extract it. And yeah, so we didn't find anything else. There were no backdoors or something else that they were using. You mean for someone that wants to find it on his server?
Well, the point is, in some cases we receive binaries and we have some binds that looks like binds. Basically, they are modified. We remove some of them, and some are, for example, using a symmetric algorithm.
Yeah.
And if it's matching one of the keys that they know, they are doing a query.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering if it's really the same one or is it different one?
That doesn't sound like the same, but maybe we can have a talk after. But concerning your question, how to figure if the bind server is compromised or not, something you can do that we did to make the analysis much easier is compile the one of the module with the debugging symbol, then export those symbol, and with bindiff and IDA you can match the. So that's what we did and figured. Okay, those are.
Kind of things like bindiff, and the thing we have no basically no differences. So basically, they use the same function names and so on.
Okay.
They just modified some of the opcode. That's it.
Okay.
That's what I
Well,
was-
with BinDiff, you probably would be able to find it.
Yeah, but
maybe.
usually they are quite clever for doing the modifications.
Okay.
That's why I was wondering if it's the same.
Okay, probably not. Another question?
You mentioned that if you poke directly how should I say, the landing or the URL, you would get blacklisted.
Yeah.
Was the process automated completely?
Yeah.
Because that could then be a tool to protect one IP to get delivered the payload.
Yes, but the problem is, and that's why I mentioned you need to have large IP pools, and ideally don't use your IP pools. Like if you use your all IP pool for automated crawling like that, you run the risk that for some of those servers, all your IPs will be blacklisted. Oh yes, it's a good thing if you want to see if you get different behaviors when you're requesting from an IP address and from another one, and if you make multiple requests, you see that the requests are you don't get the content again. It's an interesting method to figure that the servers are actually malicious. But in our case, we're mostly interested in getting those malicious files, so that's the problem we were running into. So yeah, does this answer your question?
At one point you mentioned that they were blocking 50% of IPv4 addresses.
Yeah.
But do you know why the hell did they do that? And for example, if you were about to track them and use a distributed IP pool, how do you choose your IP pool in order not to fall into this 50% of blacklisted IP addresses?
Well, you don't really. That's the problem. You don't really know. And something I also didn't mention is there was also a blacklist of languages. So the accept language in the browser, they would block some of them. So for example, Japanese was blocked. I remember Henrik from Malware Must Die was. When we published this, he said, "Oh, that explained why I was never getting any redirection when I was trying, because his browser, I guess, is configured with the Japanese language." So why would they do that? I think they're really making the trade-off that it's going to make it really complicated and really difficult for you to replicate this behavior if you try to do it on purpose. But since they're getting that much traffic, they can afford to discard some of it, and at the end, it would still get a lot of traffic. Even though they were doing that, they were still doing almost as good as the other group that we were tracking. So the blacklist, I need to ask my colleague about that. We receive other configuration, and if I'm not mistaken, I think they didn't change it between the configs that we received, but I'm not sure. Maybe they are changing it. Maybe now that I said it, maybe they will.
You had that /16, I think it was, in there with the whole load of IP addresses that you observed connecting to the connecting. And I think you said it was like all the IPs in March from this network?
Yeah, so that graph is dating back from March. So
it's from a total month.
Sorry?
So these are all the IP addresses from the total month that.
Oh, no, sorry. Maybe that was unclear. So we made the graph in March. That is from one of the blog posts. But it's all the URLs that we had seen since they switched to the new pattern. So back to November 2012. So it's for a couple months.
That's over the whole period.
Yeah, for the whole period.
Do you know what kind of network that is? I mean, is there probably some kind of DHCP or something involved, so that it's not like it's several thousand IPs infected, but a couple that are changing IP addresses?
Yeah, so it's something that that kind of put us on the wrong track at the start, and I is that there were a lot of SEO websites on those networks. And at some point we were thinking, well, is this really legitimate websites, or, you know, are they just putting a front in there to make it look like legitimate websites? But it's really the way they were being able to access all those IP addresses. The server were configured with the cPanel, and it would manage all the IP addresses. So even though there might not be any website on those IP addresses, they were still accessible and still controlled by the Apache server. So that's why we would see that many IP addresses in the networks. But we don't really know why specific networks were affected that much. I think it's really, I don't know. I don't have information about that. Any other question?
Other questions? Okay. Thank you so much, Sébastien.